Good afternoon, and welcome to the third virtual College of Liberal Arts Faculty Colloquium of the Spring 22 semester. My name is Dr. Quentin Maynard. I'm going to be moderating today's talk, as well as the final talk we have this semester in April. Before I turn things over to Dr. Gennaro, I'd like to make a few comments. We're recording this. You see the little recording button up in the top corner, and we're attempting to stream it to Facebook. If you have any questions to the speaker, go ahead and type it in the Q&A section down in your Zoom. At the end of the presentation, we've reserved time to answer those questions. If we have any students in the audience who wish to receive extra credit for attending today's talk, please send me a message. Please send me a message in the chat stating your name, your professor's name, and the course for which you receive the extra credit. Without further delay, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Rocco Gennaro. Dr. Rocco J. Gennaro is a professor of philosophy at the University of Southern Indiana. He received his PhD in 1991 at Syracuse University and had been at Indiana State University in Terre Haute for 14 years before moving here to Southern Indiana in 2009. Dr. Gennaro's primary research and teaching interests are in philosophy of mind and cognitive science, especially consciousness, metaphysics, and early modern history of philosophy. He's published 12 books, either sole author or as editor, and over 60, yes, 60, articles and book chapters in these areas. His most recent books are Consciousness, published by Routledge in 2017, Mind and Brain, a dialogue of the mind-body problem, published by Hackett in 2020, and is editor for the Routledge Handbook of Consciousness, published by Routledge in 2018. So enough about hearing my voice. Dr. Gennaro, the screen is yours.
So I'll share the screen and then we'll get started here. Let's see. I assume you can all see that all right, I hope. And so the first slide obviously is just the information and Quentin just mentioned, and I will just go down. Let me, let's see. I might just use it like this instead of, let's see. I'll just use it like this since everybody's on computer, I guess. So the outline of the talk, really this first slide is just a summary of the abstract, which probably you've all seen. So first I'll review evidence of brain damage associated with various psychopathologies. Then I will explain what I mean by the dependence thesis, metaphysical implications of it, and in terms of what's sometimes called dualism, materialism, the so-called mind-body problem. And then examine the prospects for a conscious afterlife based on the above considerations. Part of the idea, and one of the things I wanted to emphasize is, part of the idea is to show how empirical findings, in this case neurophysiological, can have a bearing on perennial debates in metaphysics, such as the mind-body problem, as it's called. How's the mind related to the body? Now, of course, it's been known for centuries that brain damage results in damage to one's mind and consciousness, but the level of detail has grown dramatically in recent decades. In other words, more specific areas causing more specific deficits of mind and so on. And of course, a classic example, which goes back quite a ways now, you find poor Phineas Gage here, a picture like this in intro psych textbooks and other things. 1848, 25-year-old Phineas Gage working with a blasting crew. There was an accident that drove that tamping iron through his head. Rod entered through his left cheekbone, past his eye, and out the top of his head. He survived the trauma, but exhibited significant behavioral changes. So poor Phineas Gage, not a shock, I guess. Exhibited some behavioral changes and mental changes, things of that type. This is a picture or recreation of what happened to Phineas Gage. As I say, they exhibited some changes in his behavior. If you notice, though, his injury was confined mainly to the frontal lobe area. If you look at the brain itself here, it really went through, again, the left cheek, left eye area, through the frontal lobe. So he did survive, but obviously there was some damage there, which caused mental damage. He was a bit more irritable and impatient, all kinds of things, which I really hope at the time they cut him a little slack for, by the way. He's got something through his head like that. Of course, normally a projectile going through, your brain would cause more damage than that, even death, right? A bullet wound to the head and so on, right? So some of you are going to be familiar with areas of the brain, and I'm not going to get into a lot of detail here, but just in the basic picture here of at least the four main lobes, right? Temporal lobe, occipital lobe in the back of the brain, right, where the visual cortex is, frontal lobe, where that injury for Phineas Gage was, and these colors indicate where in the brain some of the main functions that are pretty well understood occur, right? So motor functions, the cerebellum, you've got the motor cortex, and so on and so forth, auditory functions. And so it's the areas are fairly well understood. And although some of the areas are much more specific than what you could see on the screen, they're deep inside, for example. So what other kinds of examples are there, right? So, everybody kind of knows that if you have serious damage to your visual cortex, which is again in the back of the brain, occipital lobe, you lose vision. So people become blind, right? To all or at least part of their visual field. Same kind of thing with deafness, loss of hearing, including recognizing sounds and speech, resulted damage from the auditory cortex in the temporal lobes, right? Damage to no other area of the brain results so clearly in these visual and auditory deficits, right? And I was just going to go through a handful of these. Some of them are really kind of odd and strange. Some you're probably familiar with. There's something called hemispatial neglect, which results from damage to one hemisphere in the brain, usually the right, characterized by a deficit in attention to one side of space. It's a deficit of attention. In other words, patients tend to ignore, say, the left side of their visual field. There's nothing wrong with their visual cortex, but they tend to ignore it. It's an attentional deficit. There's something called somatoparaphrenia, which is really kind of odd, actually. It's a body delusion, it's called. Something called depersonalization disorder, where patients deny ownership of a limb or an entire side of one's body. So you have patients saying things like, this isn't my leg. What's this leg? Even in some cases, trying to cut it off, or all kinds of crazy kinds of behaviors like that. Lesions in the temporal parietal junction. I won't go through all the regions, but some of them are subcortical regions that go further in than in that diagram I had. And patients, of course, say some really strange things, these that are recorded and sometimes relayed in psychiatry by psychiatrists. Another sort of strange one, simultaneous agnosia, is impaired ability to perceive individual elements of a visual scene as parts of a whole. Again, typically associated with very particular lesions, dorsolateral, parietal, occipital cortex, damage to certain specific areas. Again, it's sort of like the area that bridges between the occipital and parietal lobe, it's called the junction there, and you get that. There are also a whole family of agnosias, they're called. So some of you are probably familiar with what's called visual agnosia, inability to recognize objects, at least to name them. Again, these patients are not blind, cortically blind. They just have trouble naming objects. There's also a very specific kind of agnosia called prosopagnosia, inability to recognize faces. So, which is sort of disturbing in many ways, right? People can't recognize faces, sometimes of even family members or whatever it is. Akinetopsia is sometimes called motion blindness, the inability to perceive motion in the visual field, while the ability to see stationary objects remains intact. It leads to a very bizarre sort of perceptions where it looks like, I don't know, it's like the patient is talking, acts as if it's like visual scenes are jumping around. You don't really see the motion. You just see sometimes afterwards what happens. And the reason for this, or one reason, is there's a very specific area in the visual cortex called the MT, or sometimes V5, that is specifically responsible for motion processing in the visual cortex. When that's damaged, specifically, you have what this sort of disorder. Amnesia, everybody knows that term. And of course, there's two different kinds of amnesia. The inability, one is the inability to remember new facts and events following damage to, for example, the hippocampus. That's called anterograde amnesia. Then there's what's called retrograde amnesia. Maybe that's the one that people think of first. The impaired memory of events that occurred for a period of time prior to damage in the limbic structure. So somebody's in a car accident and they lose memory from before the car accident, let's say, but hit their head, bad concussions or whatever it might be. That's what they lose. But the anterograde can happen too, where you have trouble forming, sort of like trouble forming new memories subsequent to the trauma, whatever it was at the time. And again, even damage to the prefrontal cortex also leads to impairment, working with short-term memory. I mean, this happened a bit to Phineas Gage. I mean, again, he did survive and he was able to be somewhat functional after a while, but I believe he died like, 12 years after the accident. He was pretty young. And people are familiar with some of what I listed here on the bottom. These are more, the first two are more like the deteriorating, like slowly over time of memory, Alzheimer's, dementia. And of course, you do hear a lot, especially if you follow football, about concussions, CTE, and so on and so forth, where you have the kind of damage that it causes more than just damage to one's memories, but also sometimes irritability again, and bursts of violence and violent behavior accompanies it. Now, one of the links that eventually is pointed to here is to immortality, or the kind of question about life after death, is one point about personal identity. Perhaps most important is that episodic memory, as it's called, and consciousness appear to be critical for maintaining one's sense of self. So memory has long been considered essential to one's personal identity through time, especially since John Locke. So the question that's raised here is often something like, what makes you the same person over time? And the answer that's given, at least partly given, is your consciousness is continuous. And one way to explain what that means is you have certain memories of past episodes in your life, right? It's especially important to note here that the Western conception of immortality, at least the Western conception, takes it for granted that you as a person would continue to exist beyond bodily death. After all, if it's not you, like literally in some sense, right, well, why would you care about what might continue after bodily death? I mean, so it's typically taken for granted. A typical Western conception of immortality has that as a main part of it. You could go on forever, but I'll stop soon about all these brain damage cases. Emotional psychopathology, right? Sometimes damage to the limbic system and the amygdala result in impaired processing of emotional stimuli, impaired perception of danger or fear. Alexithymia is another characterized, the inability to read emotions, comes from damage to orbital and cingulate cortices. Psychopaths and psychopathy, sometimes that's associated with damage to the one area of the prefrontal cortex, the ventromedial area. They display a lack of concern for moral rules, right? They're more inclined to judge moral violations. I mean, even attempted murder as morally acceptable relative to normal subjects, right? Other lesion studies indicate the involvement of other brain networks in processing basic components of empathy. So we talk about ethics, for example. Empathy seems to be almost like a necessary condition for many forms of kinds of ethics that people think about. And again, psychopathic individuals, psychopaths, it's one of the kind of common features, psychopaths, that the abnormalities in some of the brain areas, including prefrontal cortex, amygdala, you do find sometimes in criminal and violent psychopathic individual. Of course, it's a lot more complicated than that. There's a lot of variables, but at least that's another sort of thing that is under investigation now, even more, right? So when you take all this together, it seems clear that specific mental changes occur when, and only when, specific brain damage occurs. It is, of course, true that correlation, we always have to keep this in mind, is not the same as cause or identity or whatever, but the most natural explanation for all of this neuropsychological evidence seems to be, at minimum, that conscious mental activity depends for its existence on brain activity. And this is what I'll call the dependence thesis. Conscious mental processes depend upon brain processes. Now, it's useful to frame all this against the backdrop of two competing metaphysical views about the mind-body problem. And some of you are probably familiar with the big picture distinction between what's called dualism and materialism, specifically a form of dualism called substance dualism. You go back to Descartes, of course, all the way back to Plato even, and of course, many today too, holds that your mind, that a non-physical mind is associated with each physical body, that the mind is in some sense not physical, although the view usually is that it causally interacts with our bodies somehow, right? In some way. On the other hand, materialists typically hold that conscious mental activity just is identical with certain patterns of neural activity. Sometimes that's just called identity theory. It's important to keep in mind, though, that the dependence thesis does not even require strict identity between mental and brain activity. DT just mentions that conscious mental processes depend on brain activity. And, it's true, historically, there's been a traditional link between substance dualism and a belief in immortality. Indeed, belief in substance dualism is arguably often theologically motivated by the understandable desire for an afterlife. But if conscious mental activity is identical with brain activity or just dependent on it, then it would seem that when all brain activity ceases, so does all conscious experience, and therefore there's no afterlife, right? So if you lose all your visual experiences when your visual cortex is damaged, if you lose your ability to hear and have auditory experiences when all your auditory cortex is damaged, and so on and so on and so forth, obviously, upon bodily death, not to get into all kinds of grisly details, but all the brain activity ceases, and it becomes harder and harder to see how an afterlife or your consciousness continuing could occur. And there are, of course, many who point out there are several well-known independent objections to substance dualism. For example, the problem of just how such radically different substances could causally interact. If you believe that your mind is a non-physical substance that causally interacts with your body, how exactly does that happen? There's no real explanation being given, even how it's possible, and even what that means, actually, in that sense, right? Now, there are other versions of dualism, so it's not like substance dualism is the only form. But these other forms of dualism really do still kind of agree with the dependence thesis, and we'll see why. But there's a view called property dualism. Basically says, conscious experiences can't be explained like in purely physical terms or something like that, or they're not reducible, in some sense, or reducible to physical properties. And there's a view called epiphenomenalism. Mental events are caused by brain events, and so in that sense are not physical, but those mental events do not in turn cause anything physical at all. But as I said, it's crucial to emphasize that neither property dualism nor epiphenomenalism reject DT, or dependencies. That is, conscious mental activity, even on both of these versions of dualism, still depends entirely on proper brain functioning. Further, on any dualist view, there's always a further question that could be asked here. Wouldn't the mental damage present upon bodily death have to carry over to the afterlife? In other words, what kind of an afterlife is that? In other words, if somebody is dying from Alzheimer's and their mind is degenerating to the point that we know it does, if that's the state of mind that you go into the afterlife, what kind of afterlife is that? That doesn't seem like, at least in the usual way people think of what an afterlife is. So question arises here, what about an afterlife? I already alluded to maybe perhaps the difficulty here, but the basic idea then, the long been known that brain damage alters or even eliminates one's ability to have conscious experiences. It's especially clear now that very specific conscious mental processes are dependent on functioning of individual brain areas. The evidence for DT seems overwhelming. It thus stands to reason when all of one's brain activity ceases, consciousness is no longer possible, and so neither is an afterlife. That is, you cease to exist. However, is there a way out of this, or how do some people say, well, maybe this still could be an afterlife for these other counter replies, if you like. And you know how it is in philosophy anyway. Once you answer one question, even if you think you have, about 30 more come up. So you have this example of it here too, right? So here are the 5 that I'll go through pretty quickly, but each of them, I think it's fair to say, have some pretty challenging responses to deal with, right? Counter replies again too. So here's one. Someone might say, even if the mind is physical, well, what about the soul? Maybe it's the soul, not the mind, which is non-physical, as one might find in many religious traditions. Now, the problem with that has always been, even though it's true that the term soul is often used instead of mind in religious and theological contexts, it's kind of unclear just how the soul is supposed to differ from the mind. I mean, the terms are often used interchangeably in many historical texts, precisely because it's unclear what else the soul could be other than the mental substance, so to speak. And that's what people think of when they think of what goes on after death. It's your consciousness again. It's your conscious mind, isn't it? I mean, what else would it be? So this is why many believe, that's what people believe goes on after death. And it's kind of hard to make sense of a distinction. Plus, it is called the mind-body problem. I mean, which can be hard enough to deal with. What do we have now? The mind, soul, body problems. There are 3 things now that make us up. Just 2 of them is kind of hard to deal with. So I'm not sure that's ever been a very effective counter reply. What's the relation then between the soul and the mind? Someone could say, well, I agree, the mind is the brain or something, but then what about the soul? Well, then you just have the problem all over again, right? You have the same questions that come up. It doesn't necessarily help. Near-death experiences. Everybody likes hearing about these. It's kind of interesting in and of themselves. Some patients, as you know, experience peaceful moving through tunnel-like structures, often in hospital settings, ER settings, very emotional experiences, profound. Some people think it gives a bit of a glimpse of an afterlife, right? And that it shows you your mind consciousness can continue after bodily death. Of course, what materialists will point out in response will be, they'll point out that similar experiences can be artificially induced in various experimental situations, such as out-of-body experiences, OBEs. In other words, there are areas of the brain that when stimulated, patients or people have out-of-body experiences, and they start to experience something very similar. Seems to take some of the steam, at least, out of the idea that it's a glimpse of the afterlife when something like that happens. Also, starving a brain of oxygen is known to cause hallucinations, right? And that's what's happening, of course, when a brain, in these kinds of cases. Right? This is what's referred to as the dying brain hypothesis. It's bolstered by the notion of release of endorphins during times of stress and fear, can explain the feelings of peacefulness and pleasure. I don't think anybody doubts that the people have these experiences, that they're genuine, that they are very profound in some cases. I had a childhood friend that went through, something like this after being stabbed and grazed his heart and so on and so forth. And we would talk about it a bit after he recovered. He didn't necessarily think it proved there was an afterlife, but he did go through some things that made him wonder, We must remember also, the materialist might point out that near-death experiences, again, they're called near-death experiences. They're not called after-death experiences. So presumably there's some brain activity still present, right? Of course, it could be shown, if it could be shown, that one is having a conscious experience at the very time there's no brain activity at all, then that would be strong evidence for an afterlife, and maybe even substance dualism. I'm not aware of this ever happening. Part of the problem, of course, is the methodological difficulty of performing controlled and repeatable experiments. I mean, patients in this situation, everyone is focused on saving their life, right? They're not going to stick them in an fMRI machine to make sure there's absolutely no brain activity going on, not just surface, but none at all. And I don't know how we're supposed to even do experiments like this. I mean, we could try to bring people to the brink of death and ask them some questions, but I don't know. It might be hard to get IRB approval, or probably not ethical, right? Don't you think? So it's probably something that is difficult to make sense of, right? The other thing that people bring up is that even sometimes temporal lobe epilepsy or some mystical and religious experiences can often share some of those features. So some people again think, those experiences, those feelings, that experience of the traveling through a tunnel and the light and all of that, again, can be induced or caused by seizures, for example, in some cases, and that happens at times, right? There are pilots who, when they are tested as to how much G-forces they can handle, they're spun around really fast on what's called a centrifuge, and they go flying around, and to the point where they literally kind of pass out. And a lot of times what they say is right before they pass out, they have experiences that are at least somewhat like a near-death experience in terms of the tunnel-like whiteness that they experience, right? There is something called the instrument theory. That is, people respond and say something like this. A dualist reply might say, well, the brain damage doesn't really affect the independent mind at all. It just cuts off the ability for the mind to express itself through the body. It just cuts off information from the body to the mind. In other words, the brain is like an instrument through which the mind, interacts. The paper that I'm referring to here talks about television signals, but you could apply it to, I guess, internet connections or whatever. Mind exists independently of the brain, just as television signals exist independently of the television sets that receive. Damaging the brain, it's like damaging the television set or a computer, right? You can't get the internet, it doesn't mean all the internet is gone, right? All the signals or the satellites. But you interrupt, even destroy the instrument which processes the signal. Well, it's meant to be an analogy. The mind is to the brain as the signal is to the television set. Behavior would be what the pictures are on the television screen. Again, this has not really gone over too well over the years, because if the instrument theory is true, then damaging the brain really should have no effect on the mind itself in some sense, right? Just as interfering with the television internal parts does not affect the independency, but introspection reveals that altering brain states eliminates the mental states themselves. It's not just a disconnection, it looks like, right? You damage the visual cortex, from the person's point of view, right? No longer can have visual experiences. So there is damage to the mind, right? Even from the point of view of that person or patient. Or imagine saying to an Alzheimer's patient, your mind itself is not really affected. It's just your brain corrupting the signals to and from, It seems kind of absurd. It seems like the mind of the Alzheimer's patient is really affected, even from the point of view of the patient, right? Now you could go even more, you could go another direction, a little more radical for some, but not everyone. Some have argued there's at least one reason to think that DT or even materialism doesn't automatically rule out an afterlife. Perhaps an afterlife is achieved via the resurrection of bodies, which again, even in some biblical traditions, of course, resurrection of Jesus and so on. One option following John Hick is the recreation theory, according to which at some time soon after a person's death, God recreates the person by creating a duplicate body with the identical characteristics of the body that perished. The afterlife then, though, is a physical existence somewhere else. Now, that may not be the typical Western conception of immortality, or Christians say, but it is one, and there are some that allude to it. But of course, again, there are problems here, just like all of these things. But how can such a recreation preserve the personal identity? I mean, if you're recreated, it looks like maybe that you that comes into existence maybe wouldn't be you, but an exactly similar physical duplicate. Some people would argue. Why couldn't God create more than one body then, and why not two or more? And of course, the one thing that everybody notices immediately on the bottom here is that this line of argument, of course, already presupposes that God exists in the first place. Now, that's an assumption that, of course, some are willing to make, or maybe they think they've already shown God exists, or they already believe it, or whatever. But obviously, normally, that's a pretty major background assumption in order to respond to this kind of challenge, right? And not everybody, certainly in philosophical circles, it's not going to be an uncontroversial presupposition or background belief, right? Another related option is it's another version of the same of Peter Van Inwagen. Perhaps at the moment of each person's death, God removes the corpse, replaces it with a copy. Then wouldn't any brain damage then carry over to the afterlife? Again, you have that question that comes up. Well, maybe God fixes that too, right? Just restores. I mean, we know that there are corpses obviously in graveyards, right? So it's not like what people normally think of as like a resurrection of Jesus or something like that, right? The last cluster of possibilities are a little bit all over the place, but some we might call an Eastern approach. Immortality, or afterlife at least, is also brought up in Eastern religions, but not in the same way. So people bring up, what about reincarnation? Of course, going back to the point I made about personal identity, many people, of course, at least Western philosophy, are going to wonder, is that really you? I mean, if you don't remember things from, is it really you? It gets to the point where in Western philosophy, people find that alternative very, not very plausible, right? And, if we're talking about rewarding or punishing or whatever, who's in charge, how could we know, and so on. And there's no real belief in a transcendent, conscious God to do all the work, right? Eastern philosophies are known, and religions are known for not having a belief in what they call the self. So in that case, there really isn't a you that continues anyway. Kind of defeats the purpose of at least most Western conceptions of immortality. You could hold a view called idealism, and many in Eastern thought do. But idealism, for those of you who don't know, is basically the view there are only minds and ideas. There are no mind-independent physical objects at all. There are only minds and ideas. But again, then you run into a different kind of problem. There are many other objections to it, actually. But one of them is, how would somebody who believes that explain why or how neural damage causes damage to consciousness? A final possibility, not necessarily the Eastern one, I just put it at the bottom of the slide, is, in recent years with all the AI stuff and sci-fi movies and everything else, you do have some talking about, well, you can have a kind of immortality of a different kind. Why can't we upload our minds, or what's in our brains, so to speak, into a computer? But obviously many are going to think, even if you somehow, if we could upload the information or some memories or something like that, that again, are we gonna believe, or do we believe that that would be conscious, right? Conscious memories, would that be you continuing to exist really, or just some representation of what was in your mind or brain before death? Right? So concluding, it seems clear from the extensive empirical evidence drawn from brain damage studies, the existence of human conscious states is dependent on functioning individual brains. There seems to be strong evidence in favor of DT, which we must recall is even weaker claim than some materialist identity theory. Having a functioning brain at minimum seems necessary for having human conscious experience, and thus conscious experience ends when brain ceases to function. As much as we might wish for there to be an afterlife, it seems very unlikely, at least, although, again, notwithstanding even the previous possibilities, maybe there are others. It may be impossible to rule it out, of course, with any kind of certainty, but it seems like something that people would be, it'd be reasonable to conclude, at least based on the evidence. Here are a couple of the books that Quentin mentioned, recent years, a single author one on the left, the anthology on the right, about 30 or 40 papers on all kinds of areas of consciousness, not just this, but lots of other areas. And then I put out a second edition of a dialogue I published over 20 years ago. This one's a bit shorter, and it's written in dialogue form, which is something a lot of people familiar with Plato, going back to Plato, right, in philosophy, with 3 characters, and sometimes I'll use it in classes as well. For students out there or whoever else, I've been advertising this course in the fall called Consciousness, cross-listed, philosophy and psychology, Tuesday, Thursday, 3 to 4:15. And there might also be students who are interested, or faculty. Keep in mind that we have a new 18-credit religious studies minor, which is something that also we try to advertise in terms of students interested just more generally on religious issues, world religions, and so on. Right? So I'll just end it there and say thanks.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Gennaro.
Sure.
We have one question. And again, if anyone else has any other questions that came up during this presentation, go ahead, post it in the Q&A tab. But the one question we have is from Michaela. It says, you mentioned that certain mental changes occur. Only occur when specific brain damage happens. Is this true with psychopathy, or can someone be born with that as a psychiatric disorder?
It's true. It's a psychopathy, like those slides I had up there with, for psychopaths. However, there is always the question of how does the brains of those people get like that? I mean, it could be in some cases, of course, and maybe there are some of these cases, I'm talking about psychopaths, where there's something about the way their brains formed. It wasn't necessarily brain damage after, it was the way the brain formed, even very young or even in the womb, which led to this kind of disorder. It's also possible that, early experiences a child has. Perhaps also there are some cases of genetic predispositions to certain kinds of brain structure and or abnormalities and those kinds of things. So even though mental changes occur, very specific mental changes occur only when specific brain damage happens, it is possible that those brain changes, I mean, instead of brain damage, you could say abnormal brain activity or, abnormal brain structure can happen very early on and even be born with, or if not born with, something that results early on in someone's life.
So thank you, Dr. Gennaro, for this fascinating presentation. Like I said before we joined, I was really excited about this one. So thank you. Everyone else who's attended, thank you for joining. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you again for attending this talk. Before I conclude, I'd like to just announce the final presentation this semester, April 22nd, 3 p.m. on Zoom. Jason Callahan's presentation is titled Law and Disorder, Assessing Conflicting News Coverage of Police Use of Force. Looks like actually, someone just said thanks for the presentation.
Thanks to everybody for coming too. If you have a question that you want to just send me an email or whatever it might be, I can answer, or something about for students, about class or whatever, just let me know, because there's always more to all of these kinds of debates. And they're kind of interesting to see how they go. Lots of other kinds of disorders, and some cases kind of strange and frightening, disorders that can happen with strokes and lesions, accidents, trauma, and that sort of thing. But let me know the email if you have a question, you want to follow up, if you think of something later. But otherwise, I appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah. And so with that, we're done with today's session. Again, thank you, Dr. Gennaro, and thank everyone else for attending. We look forward to seeing you at the next faculty colloquium. Have a great day and weekend. Let's hope this weather gets nice, right?
Yeah.